Hello and welcome to this video on getting your vinegar from your vinegar mother in solution. Making vinegar can be rather straightforward, albeit when made by accident. You simply leave a bottle of apple juice or anything similarly full of sugar and or alcohol out in the open for long enough. This will make vinegar among other unwanted products. To get vinegar that is reliable, you need to add only what you want to get vinegar from. Apple juice or apple cider for apple cider vinegar, a white wine for white wine vinegar, a red wine for, well, you get the idea by now, hopefully. This will leave you with a bottle full of 4 major parts in decreasing concentrations and volume. You have a mixture of vinegar, unfermented sugars, and other ingredients, likely to be some alcohol amongst a few other bits and pieces that aren't too important. You have a vinegar mother, and unwanted vinegar inclusions, and solids that are not part of the vinegar mother. These 4 parts each need to be addressed in order to maximize the vinegar you get with best flavor and lowest chances of it going bad. The first thing you do is relatively simple enough. You try to separate the vinegar mother from the vinegar, if you can. This is done by slipping a spoon, spatula, ladle, or something similar underneath it and lifting it out. You can now add this to another batch of vinegar that you are preparing. If you do not plan to make more vinegar, or at least something similar, you can discard it, and by discarding it, you can skip straight to step 2, which does save you some hassle. If you intend to keep the vinegar going, but you don't have an immediate use for it, you will need to also keep the vinegar mother, and you can consider, for example, freezing it, or adding it to a very small amount of the necessary ingredients to tide the mother over until you get the next batch going. Step 2 is what makes things easier if you're intending to simply discard the mother as is, and it's a filtering step. The easiest option is something like a simple coffee filter, a paper coffee filter, and you place this over the mouth or opening of your storage jar, bottle, etc. Pour the vinegar into this filter. It will remove the unwanted solids, which can include the vinegar mother if you intend to discard it. And now what you have left is, more or less, just vinegar. You'll have the few unwanted byproducts or products of vinegar, and a few of the other ingredients, but these are dealt with in step 3. And to separate your vinegar as a relatively pure substance from everything else, you have a few options. Some are a little more practical than others. The most direct is to literally distill the vinegar. This will give you a pure vinegar product if done with a column still, basically acetic acid. A pot still, on the other hand, will give you a flavored vinegar. There are 2 parts to this approach that are worth noting, and they're kind of important. One is that you need to thoroughly clean the still, or else you can contaminate your spirits later if you are going to distill it. The other is that you need more equipment that may not be available. This leads to the other option. Option 2 will leave you a more live acetobacter in your vinegar. You need to strain your vinegar again, then put it in the fridge to cold crash the vinegar, thereby removing cells, extra sugars, and more through sedimentation. This should leave you with a mostly only vinegar solution. To be clear, this is not perfect, and it will leave live vinegar cells, or I should say it'll be a live vinegar with acetobacter cells within it. As a consequence, however, it will be somewhat more flavorful than either pot or column distillation methods, because you haven't removed all of the content that is contributing flavors. In fact, you've left most of it behind, and because it is still alive, the vinegar will continue to produce flavors over time. This does bring us to the last point about vinegar, particularly the live cells within it. In order to ensure that your vinegar, at least in theory, should last for as long as you possibly want, and you're trying to isolate and purify it, you can, particularly if you're not intending to keep a live vinegar culture, pasteurize the vinegar. The pasteurization involves heating the vinegar to a high enough temperature, typically boiling point, for a time, and then killing the microorganisms that way. Now, this will keep your vinegar stable, but as mentioned, it will kill the microorganisms, including the acetobacter that are within it, the acetobacter that are what contribute to the production of vinegar. or more accurately acetic acid, that make vinegar. The reason this is ideal is for stability. Arguably, in order to get a stable vinegar, you want to keep the vinegar for a long time, and the only way to ensure that it will not change over time is to ensure there is nothing in there to change. The primary thing you're going to be doing therefore is killing anything that is alive within it. This is where pasteurization is useful. It is worth pointing out that you do not have to use pasteurization. This is simply one of those things that if you want to keep it for as long as possible, with as little change as possible, it's a good option. If you store vinegar correctly, it can theoretically store for basically forever. That's because it's relatively inert once all the fermentation is finished. If you keep it in a cool, dark place away from sunlight. Heat and light are the bane of vinegar, and not just because it will have an adverse effect on the acetic acid. That honestly won't happen at first, and that's the least of your worries. It's all the other changes that heat and light cause. Not just these two though. The combination of heat and light will also interfere with any oxygen that is within it, causing an alteration in the taste and appearance of your vinegar. This is where things begin to cascade, as the oxygen will effectively become a reactive oxygen species. That will then cause further changes, which then cause more changes in other things, and the cascade starts. You don't need to stress as much for about a year. As with most vinegars, they can last up to a year in some of the more undesirable conditions. But if you intend to store them any longer than a year, you want to put them somewhere better. For example, things like balsamic vinegar will become increasingly acidic over time, and you'll notably pick it up after about a year of storage, and that's even under good conditions. Although you'll note that it becomes more bitter or acidic, it's still perfectly edible, or at least able to be used for flavouring of foods and for preserving. You may not want to use it for things like a salad, however. Further to that, we have, as mentioned, the change in appearance. Now, we don't just have the change in appearance due to oxidation. That's one entire issue on its own. But there are other issues, particularly if we're talking about a live vinegar. Cloudiness and sediment are another common problem. This is when you begin to see the vinegar turning hazy, mostly down to the fact that the acetobacter within it begin to multiply, and this causes the bacteria within suspension to show up and become visible, along with all of the byproducts of their fermentation to make more vinegar. Sedimentation occurs when those same bacteria and other materials either die or just gradually sink to the bottom of the bottle. Depending on how you view these things, it won't alter the taste very much, but it can be an aesthetic issue. Some people have a particular problem with their cider being cloudy, which can be understood in terms of the, as mentioned, aesthetic value. This is how you can separate, isolate, and to a certain extent purify your vinegar for best appearance, flavour, aroma, and long-term stability. Depending on how you want to approach this, you can use some of it, all of it, or none of it all. It's entirely up to you, but if you have the information, you can then act accordingly. Thank you for watching this video. If you have found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.